Hey guys, so I decided to do ethnomusicology, which is studying music through a cultural point of view. Ethnomusicology is the study of music within different cultures. I'm going to be using this to explain how music varies from culture to culture, yet show how no matter how different each culture is, music is still a factor that connects us all. Ethnomusicology is the study of music in its cultural context. Ethnomusicologists approach music as a social process in order to understand not only what music is, but why it is, what music means to its practitioners and audiences, and how those meanings are conveyed. And I wanted to give a short, brief intro of music history. The term music comes from ancient Greece. There were 9 muses who represented the arts and science. Historically, music was first documented around 500 BC, where Pythagoras, the philosopher, began experimenting with acoustics while he plucked away at strings and relayed how math formed those tones. Now I wanted to show the 6 periods of historically of music that resonates with our Western culture and ideas of music. Those are the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Baroque period, the Classical period, the Romantic period, and the 20th century and into the present time. Go back. Now the Middle Ages, in this time music was culturally limited to mostly churches and religious ceremonies. By the 12th century, music culturally started to shift out of the church and, quote, secular music was starting to arise. Culturally, at this time, music was limited to those only in nobility, the privileged people who were able to keep minstrels. During the Renaissance period, music became more popular and widespread. Instead of being limited to only nobility, the commoners were getting in tune to their own musical conquest and were being hired to compose by kings and queens. Now, the Baroque period is where we start getting more familiar with composers such as Bach and Pachelbel. This was the age when music really began to evolve socially within Western cultures in Europe. Now, the classical period, we have composers such as Beethoven and Mozart, and this was the period where concerts started popping up, and more people of the middle and lower classes were able to go to these concerts, not just the upper class people. And the Romantic period was during the time when a lot of immigrants from Europe were coming over to America, and with that they brought music with them, and so that European influx also helped in spreading that idea of Western music to the United States. And now the 20th century to present is what we have culturally music today. And you might be wondering why this is so important. It's important to understand the history of how music came about, because this history sets the stage for what we know today in our Western culture about music. Everything we understand about our music culture came from these time periods in European history. It is important also to understand the differing types of music within different cultures around the globe, so we can learn about their cultural differences in music than what we are familiar with. So let's take a look about how other cultures do music. I wanted to first focus on the Eastern culture. And while there are thousands of different subcultures musically in the Eastern culture, I am choosing to point out the 3 specific types of cultures today: the Chinese music culture, the Indian music culture, and the Middle Eastern music culture. The reason for this is simply because these 3 music cultures are the foundations to what the majority of Eastern culture knows musically today. Now let's look at Chinese music culture. Chinese music can be traced back to the Han Dynasty in 206 BC. At the time, the foundation of the Western music, Chinese music began for religious purposes. During the early parts of Chinese history and all the way through the Ottoman Empire, there was a large surge of varying religions in the area: Buddhist, Confucius, Hindu, and Muslim, just to name a few. Traditional Chinese music was a way to distinguish their Confucius and Buddhist beliefs from the other religions insurging into their culture. The Chinese music also developed culturally as a way for the common peasants of the time to describe to one another their daily lives working within society. This could be fishing, working in a field, farming, etc. Today, while the Chinese music culture is more modern and even more westernized, it still holds roots to its traditional cultural meanings. Now let's look at the Indian music culture. Like the other cultures we have discussed, Indian music started based on religion, and that religion was mainly the Hindu religion. Much like the Hindu music is completely devotional, almost like chants or prayers of the various gods of the Hindu religion. During the 13th century in India, there was a large influence of Muslims within the region, so, like Chinese music, the Hindu music was a way for people to differentiate from Hindus from the Muslims. Much of India's music historically was written in Sanskrit and is still today for the most part. Around the 1960s, the culture of Indian music made a transition more towards the music of the West, while still holding roots of the Eastern culture. Today, Indian culture is very big on musicals, movies, or Bollywood movies as we know them. This is the type of music most Indians relate to culturally today. Now we're going to look at Middle Eastern music culture. Middle Eastern music culture is less original than other Eastern music because it has been influenced over the centuries by various empires and cultures. These include the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Balkans. Again, the Islam religion plays a big role in the culture of Middle Eastern music. Even today, besides the westernized Middle Eastern pop stars, the sole purpose of the music is religious in the Middle East. The largest cult of prayer is known as the Adhan, an Islamic vocal tune that lets Muslims know it is time to go to mosque. I also wanted to take a look at the African music culture as well. Culturally speaking, music-wise, the continent of Africa remains one of the most traditional when it comes to music. Unlike the majority of cultures today, the African cultures use their music in their everyday lives, and still do to this day. One of the most important and traditional aspects of African music culture is dance. This is because there are so many different languages within Africa, with all the various tribes, that dancing to music is in a sense a universal language. Within African culture, a dance is done by a tribal community or group for specific ceremonies such as a war, life, or death ceremony. Vocals are also an important part of the African music culture. War songs, for example, were and still are used before a battle to stir up the tribe's morale before the fight. Unlike the Western and Eastern cultures when it comes to music, the African music culture is still deeply rooted in its origins, and many of the tribes and people groups within the African continent still use those same musical techniques as they did thousands of years before. As we have discussed, there are many differing types of music culturally throughout the globe. Our Western perspective of music is founded on musicians such as Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. The Renaissance and classical periods of music defined how we look at music as a Western culture. Unlike our culture, the Eastern music culture still uses traditions that were developed long ago in their modern music culture. However, all of the differing cultures have become westernized in a sense. The African culture musically still holds entirely to their past traditions of song and dance, which are thousands of years in the making. Regardless of our cultural differences, music is one thing that is universal, no matter what part of the world we hail from. Every culture has some sort of music and tradition behind it. So, even though cultures might vary, music is one thing that connects us all, because each and every one of our cultures can relate. Music is in a sense a universal language.